a message about now, and you'll have to click OK. And following this event, you'll be able to find a link to the recording of this event on the page where you signed up. In addition, in the chat, I'll send you a link where you can find out more information about the Graduate Certificate in Terrorism Analysis on our website, which this talk is adapted from. And with that said, I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Marcus Boyd is the Graduate Studies Director and Head of Geospatial Analysis at START, where he oversees research relating to terrorism, illicit finance, and GIS science. He has advanced methodological training in spatial statistics, demography, sociology, and geographic information systems. And Marcus, you can take it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen, and we will get started. All right, so again, thank you for joining today. We're going to be talking about defining terrorism, what that means. So first off, who am I? So I have been at START since 2014 as the head of geospatial research, and over the last year, about a year to the day, I've been the head of graduate studies at START. So I head up our graduate certificate and the master's degree that we are beginning to build and hope to start sometime in 2021. So prior to START, I have worked in various positions in and around the US IC, and then my education is displayed here. So my PhD is in geography. I do have a master's degree in philosophy and social policy, a bachelor's in history. This is you may wonder, okay, well, why is a geographer talking about defining what terrorism means? Well, I'm more of a human geographer and a sociologist than I am than I am a computational geographer, or sort of a GIS analyst, as you typically will hear about it. So we blend a lot of the social science skills, and you'll see in the presentation what I mean. So what we are achieving today. So the first bit is a taste of academic terrorism research. So everyone is familiar with Hollywood and TV shows and all of the sort of fun bits that go along with terrorism analysis and research. But this is really a taste of what academic research is like, building objective research methods into our definitions and really understanding more complexity to the analysis. The other things that I'm trying to do are obviously build interest in our graduate program. I've put a link there, and Erin will be sending out a link afterwards. And then I really want to foster further discussion on what is terrorism, and terrorist, what these things mean. So, terrorism, what is it? Well, it's a complex question. And it's something that, as a term, has been around for a very long time. It's not new. It is not specific to ideology or group or ethnicity or race. It is really much more than that. So, at the risk of giving away the entire sort of lecture here, there's no agreed upon definition. So everything that I'm going to be saying to you is some mixture of what other people have said, what we tend to agree on, and my opinion as an academic. Now, why does it matter what the word terrorism means? Well, in sort of the popular way that we conceive it, it doesn't necessarily matter until it does. We throw around the word terrorist, and then sometimes we don't use the word terrorist. And if you use social media, you see these kinds of debates happening. So things like, what we are much more likely to call someone who commits an attack who is an adherent to Islam a terrorist than we are a white person who has committed an attack from some sort of far-right ideological background. So we throw around these terms, and in the way they're used on social media and in popular sort of media, this just sort of, nobody has real control over how you define things or how each individual across the planet defines things on their own. But in legal and academic circles, we can't prosecute or measure these trends and these tactics without having clear boundaries. And so that's really what we're focused in here. So we have to take a step back. We can't just jump straight in and define terrorism. We have to build the theory. We have to understand what are the theoretical sort of underpinnings of what we're doing and trying to build an objective definition. So I'm going to, over a few slides, give a sort of an overview of deviance, labeling, and the other. So deviance is in some ways complex. It's this recognized violation of cultural norms. So it is the basis of the in-group and the out-group. If you are a part of the in-group, you understand the cultural societal norms. If you are not a part of the in-group, you don't understand those norms. If you violate those cultural norms, you are now a deviant. This can be anything from taking spray paint and tagging a wall up to committing murder or rape, so any kind of gradient of defense, of offense, right, fits under the categories of deviance. Talking back to your parents fits under deviant behavior in some cultures and societies. So there's this gradient of what the violations are, and as a part of those violations, what the punishments there are. So we do have these social norms and expectations, and crimes are the violation of these norms that have been codified into criminal law. They are so severe that we say, yes, these are things that have to be punishable by legitimate authority. So deviance has the ability to create these negative sanctions. So anytime there is social disapproval, anytime you have broken a cultural or social norm, there is this social disapproval, and then there is a cost to it. If it's talking back to your parents, the consequence may be that you're screened free or that you're grounded or whatever, right? But if you are committing a murder, then in some societies that could mean that you will then be put to death. If you've stolen something, you will go to jail, you will have a fine, right? So there are all of these different gradients of social costs embedded into the gradient of deviance. All of this is then wrapped up in social power. So the norms and rules are dependent on who sets the definitions. So what the laws are, how those laws shift and change, how the rules shift and change, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, all of that is sort of bound up in who has the power to change these things. So Berger and Luckman back in 1966, give us the idea of social construction. And basically, in a nutshell, what that means is that you don't set reality. Each individual does not set their own reality. We all set reality. We all construct it together. And out of this construction, we agree upon rules and codes, mores of conduct. And so this is really what we're sort of doing in our daily lives. We have built up a legitimate reality. And in that reality, we all adhere to the same general principles and ideas. And when we don't, we are punished for those. So beyond just deviance and social control and all of that, deviance gives us the ability to gives us the language to deem things as abnormal, something that we as a society say, that's not normal, that is over there, right? Now, Becker in 1963, he does this study of deviance, and he develops labeling theory. And out of labeling theory, we understand that there are different ways that we label people, different ways that we label their statuses. So a person's master status, my master status may be that I'm graduate director or that I'm an academician. It could be that I'm a white male. There are lots of different ways you can label folks. One of the ways that you can label someone is by their profession. Like I said, I'm an academician. But you can also label someone as a criminal or as a terrorist. And once you have branded someone by their career, if that career is negative, then you have this forced step towards a deviant career. And it is very difficult to escape that. Now, the other is not equal to the self. The other and otherness sort of conceptualized can be conceptualized as a neutral signifier. But when we use it in the social sciences, we are using it to discuss this system of deviance, right? This built out system where we're looking at in-group, which is us, and the other as the out-group, which is not us. So the trouble here is that the other can easily be turned into an object. So the other as being not a part of the self's community, as not being a part of the neighbor, the neighborhood, or whatever the self identifies as the community, can quite easily objectify the other and see the other as less than and delegitimize them. So devalue or label the other as something less than, something as subhuman. This becomes valuable when you are conceptualizing both the terrorist, so how you view the terrorist, someone that you have labeled as a terrorist, and it also has to do with how the terrorist views the people that they are terrorizing. So with that, getting into defining terrorism. So there are two purposes to a definition. The first is we need a legal definition of terrorism. We have to know what's forbidden, we have to know what's not allowed, and we have to be able to prosecute it, frankly. In an academic or scholarly definition, we have to be able to research the topic. So when we look back through history and we're trying to construct, well, what is terrorism? Which of these things are terrorism, which are not terrorism? We need to be able to have a definition of what fits and what doesn't. Common definitions allow us the ability to then replicate results, make policy recommendations, and just generally, make good science. So when it comes to criminalizing terrorism, the first bit is that there can be no crime without law. So government must define these acts. They must define what's forbidden. If it's not forbidden, then you can't punish it. Terrorism, we know, is a set of acts. It's a set of tactics. It's not an ideology. It is not a sort of a mode that's dependent on any culture or society. It is a set of tactics that are used and a set of methods that are used. Ben Saw, who's a law professor down at the University of Sydney in Australia, he comes up with this idea of, okay, what is needed in a definition? And he says things like, it has to seriously violate human rights, it has to jeopardize the state, the deliberative politics and the constitutional order. You have to have things that show that there's a politically or publicly motivated violence that's distinguishable from private violence, threatens international peace or security, requires definition to control the operation of mandatory Security Council measures, all of that. And so what we're seeing here is really the sort of basis of this norm setting and rule setting. That for something to be terrorism, part of what that means is that it has to be in some way separate. It has to somehow be threatening to the legitimate order of society and to the legitimate authority of society. So prior to September 11th, 2001, there was no real agreed upon international definition of terrorism. It didn't really particularly matter, to be honest. There was an exceptionally low rate of international terrorism. A lot of the terrorism that occurred domestically within a country. And really, most terrorism is still domestic in nature. The people who are planning an attack will attack within the same country that they're in. So this sort of international conceptualization really stems from the 2001 terror attacks and subsequent terrorist attacks by a handful of actors. So Security Council Resolution 1373 obligates UN members to criminalize various types of behavior and various things. So things like financing terrorism, suppressing terrorist groups, denying refugee status to terrorists, preventing the movements of terrorists, and bringing terrorists to justice, and establishing terrorist acts as a serious domestic crime. Now, one of the faults, as I see it, and as others see it, with 1373, is that what this means is that each individual state gets to make their own laws and gets to designate their own groups, whomever they decide, as a terrorist entity. Now, there's a lot of overlap in how states define these things, particularly in the sanctions lists, but the overlap is not complete. So there are these disagreements, at least on paper, over what does and what does not constitute a terrorist group or entity internationally. Now, self-determination conflicts are important to mention here because Resolution 1373 gives governments the ability to name rebels as terrorists. And one of the outcomes of this is that there are various groups that want self-governance, that seek self-governance, and for various reasons. Some of these have to do with decolonization, some of them have to do with longstanding ethnic or tribal beliefs or desires, some of them are quasi-religious in basis. Some of them are purely political. So the proposal for multiple Californias, for example, there are all kinds of reasons why you would want to have your own self-governance, why you feel like the current governance that you have is not meeting your needs. And so there are defendable reasons for self-determination conflicts occurring. As I sit here in the United States, I have to say that because I'm in the United States because of a self-determination conflict that happened in 1776. So some legal scholars argue that during such conflicts, if the aggrieved party targets purely military objectives, then they're within recognized laws of warfare. So there's this long-standing, I mean, millennia-old philosophical and legal understanding of what is acceptable and unacceptable violence. Some of this stems to things like just war theory, that you are allowed to do certain things under international law, and that there is permissible violence. The issue becomes when you start targeting civilians. Now, does this legitimize groups like the Islamic State? And the answer is absolutely not. The Islamic State, had they only targeted military targets, I don't know. We'd have to investigate that. We'd have to talk about that. We'd have to really consider what does that mean. However, even if you are only targeting military targets, if you are using terrorist targets or terrorist tactics to go after those targets, then the answer is yes, you're committing terrorism. So then there's also this illegal but justifiable sort of trend throughout the history of law. Now, Ben Saul gives us this quote. There are various examples, so things like collective defense of human rights and political amnesties and pardons. Is this like jury nullification? So in the United States, we have this, it's an unwritten, but it's a rule. You can have video evidence that a crime was committed. You can have the person admit to the crime that they committed, and the jury can say, we see all of this evidence and you are not guilty. That is, in and of itself is a part of the system that we live under. And what we are saying is there are acceptable reasons for violence on occasion. But we have to recognize there's a taboo to this. And it's pretty much the universal taboo. So we rarely can be justified in the instrumental killing of non-harmful civilians, including the killings to indulge religious passions. So, what Ben Saul is reminding us there is that there's never really a good excuse for killing civilians. That just doesn't really work. When it comes to international law, and you look at the various philosophy and history of all of these sort of terms and ideas, there's never really been an argument successfully made for killing civilians. Now, towards sort of an international human rights law definition, what we need to be able to include is any serious violent criminal act intended to cause death or serious bodily injury that's committed outside of armed conflict for political, ideological, religious, or ethnic purposes, and that intends to create extreme fear in a person, a group, or the general public. Now, what's separate from this is advocacy, protest, dissent, and industrial actions not intended to cause death or serious bodily harm. These would not constitute a terrorist act. So what Ben saw in his sort of conception of an international human rights law definition sort of tries to put together here is this idea of there are permissible ways to offer civil disobedience. There are impermissible ways, and those impermissible ways should be punishable by a domestic court, by an international court, because we see them universally as reprehensible. Now, notice that the definition that we've put together would exclude the bulk of attacks committed by narco traffickers and drug cartels. And this is can be perplexing when it's first brought up, when it's first mentioned. And the reason why I mention it, and I always mention it in my grad class when I teach 630, I put this at the front and center because it's a very interesting case of how it can look like terrorism, but not be terrorism. So drug cartels and narco traffickers fit for many reasons, but they lack the motive of a terrorist organization. They're not doing this for political, ideological, religious, or ethnic purposes. They're doing it pretty much purely for economic gain. Now, there are instances with drug cartels where you do have these sort of interesting aspects. So if you've seen Narcos, for example, or if you're familiar with the Pablo Escobar's cartel, the sort of violence that they were doing fits organized crime, right? The laws that are there to meet and stop organized crime are longstanding. It's when Escobar gets together with other cartels and creates the extraditables, and then they start committing attacks to try to change government policy. That's when they start committing terrorist attacks. And when you look in the global terrorism database that START houses, you can see those attacks. Those attacks are present. But very few, only a handful of attacks perpetrated by either the Mexican or Colombia cartels are in the database. And the reason for that is because they have primarily economic motives. They're not trying to change policy. They're not trying to change society. It's a different conception. And that's sort of an interesting dichotomy that is just worth mentioning, I think. Now, beware, there are some walls of text ahead, but these are important walls of text. These are from three, so this is a diplomat and scholar, and I've highlighted what matters here. The political value of the term, so terrorism, currently prevails over its legal one. So terrorism easily falls prey to change that suits the interest of a particular state at particular times. And then he goes through and he outlines the ways in which different entities view different groups. So one legitimate authority says that says that X group is a rebel group. The other legitimate authority says they are a terrorist organization, and on and on and on. And so what we're seeing here is this does not work in international law. This does not create sort of a harmonious sort of reasoning by our various legitimate authorities at different levels. Likewise, Bruce Hoffman, who's a terrorism scholar at Georgetown, has been doing this a lot longer than I have. He says, look, the decision to call someone or label some organization terrorist becomes almost unavoidably subjective, depending largely on whether one sympathizes with or opposes the person, group, cause concerned. Okay, so very similar to what our previous gentleman was saying. And then Ben Saul again says, look, that terrorism has the ability, the capacity, the term has the capacity to stigmatize, delegitimize, denigrate, and dehumanize those at whom it's directed, including political opponents. So what we get out of that is that these definitions are inherently political. The legal definitions are inherently political. And that is problematic because we want objective laws that hold all accountable equally. So the political definitions are driven by labeling. by labeling in-group versus out-group, by punishing those who challenge legitimate authority. And this results in, like I said, various types of disagreement. So as far as an academic definition, what I'm really looking for here is a social science definition. So we can rely a bit on something that's called interpretive sociology, right? How do we interpret society? So what are the meanings attached to social behavior? And like I said much earlier, reality is constructed by people. So groups of people specifically. There's no objective reality that's greater than our joint human consciousness. And it relies largely on qualitative and quantitative data. So our goal isn't to punish criminals. It's not what academicians do. It's to understand why they do what they do. So what I've listed here Verstehen, which is a German word for understanding, and it is used by Max Weber, one of the first sociologists, to say, look, this is what sociology is. Sociology is Verstehen. It's understanding. It's understanding why individuals do things in a social context. So what's really the behavior here, and why is it happening? Now, Schmidt gives us this answer. He gives us this consensus definition after looking through it. And he gives it back in 1988. He says, look, terrorism is this anxiety-inspiring method perpetrated by folks for idiosyncratic criminal or political reasons. The direct targets of the violence are not the main targets. They're chosen randomly, so these are targets of opportunity, or selectively they're representative of symbolic targets. And they serve as message generators. So you have threat and violence-based communication that's happening here. And that really the target of terror, target of demands, target of attention, depends on whether intimidation, coercion, or propaganda. Okay, so this is a much different, in many ways, definition than what we've seen from the legal scholars. So notice here, as an aside, Smith's definition includes this term anxiety inspiring. That's not in these legal definitions that we've seen. And to give you some like, let's critically think about what anxiety means. So in the DSM-5, anxiety is not the same as fear, which is the response to a real or perceived immediate threat. Anxiety is the expectation of future threat, right? So that's a very specific type of feeling. Kierkegaard gives us anxiety appears when we need to make life-altering choices. And then Freud says, look, it's a reaction to traumatic situations, an expression of helplessness. And then Lacan says anxiety, as we know it, is always connected with a loss, with a two-sided relation on the point of fading away to be superseded by something else, something which the patient cannot face without vertigo. So anxiety inspiring is a very specific term. And I think Schmidt puts it there for a reason, because it is not just fear. It is this thing that lasts for a very long time after the event occurs. It is life altering. It causes you to change your behavior. Whether or not you were the initial target, you may not go out because you think there may be another bombing, there may be another sort of mass shooting, right? Whatever the sort of thing is that's out there that was the terrorist event, causes this prolonged anxiety that continues long after the event is over. Now, a normed definition. Global Terrorism Database, which I mentioned earlier, has been around since 1970. It's presently housed at START, like I said. And to be included in the GTD, an event has to meet 2 of 3 inclusion criteria. Briefly, so the act must be aimed at attaining a political, economic, religious, or social goal. Now, they include economic goals, but they note that the economic goal can't be pursuit of profit, the exclusive pursuit of profit. It has to involve something more profound. So like the extraditables, like Pablo Escobar still wanted to make lots of money with selling drugs, but he started committing terrorist attacks because he wanted to change policies to make it easier for him to attain his economic goals. Criterion 2 must be evidence some other message to a larger audience. And then the action must be outside the context of legitimate warfare activities. So if you are in warfare, you may not be committing a terrorist attack. Now, GTD also does this thing that I think is quite smart. And I just want to affirm for everyone, I'm not a part of the GTD staff. I do work at START. I work with those folks, but I am separate of those folks. And I don't have any say over what gets included, what doesn't get included. I get to stand here and admire what they do more or less objectively. So they have this terrorism proper variable that they include. And what this does is it gives this room to suggest that maybe this wasn't a terrorist event, maybe it was a terrorist event. And they note that there's this definitional overlap between terrorism and other forms of crime and political violence, and things that you may want to include and you may not want to include. So when you look through the GTD, you want to look at this variable and make sure that you're including what you mean to include and not what you don't mean to include. So they have these they have them coded in various ways in a subsequent variable. So lastly, I want to leave you with a bit of a coda, because I think there's something that still needs sort of left to be said in all of this. So really, what is an expression of terrorism? So the first expression of terror is in one's rejection of others' history, others' beliefs, others' cultural markers, and others' traditions. So what I'm striving for here in this bit is really looking at, well, what does the terrorist do? So not just what is the terrorist's intent, but what is the terrorist doing when they commit an attack? And what they're doing is they're negating the other. They are taking away all of these things about the person who is not like them, who's not a part of the terrorist's group. They displace people by simply denying the other's culture, the other's history, the other's beliefs, the other's values, by not accepting these things. Now, this doesn't appear in academic definitions, but something that comes out of this is whether or not states can commit acts of terrorism. And this is a dicey topic. Schmidt does include state actors in his consensus definition, but it is in many ways lacking from many of the definitions that appear in academia and in law. So something like sovereign authority and legitimate authority is difficult for us to grasp as something that can commit an act of terrorism. So throughout all of Western history and Western philosophy, we have this idea of sovereign authority and legitimate authority that goes back to Plato, Socrates, and all the greats of philosophy, right? That we agree to certain things. Hobbes' Leviathan, for example, is this sort of coming to grasp of democracy. And what does that mean? What happens when everyone is equal in a democracy? Who gets to make the final decisions when everyone is equal? Who has power over life and death if everyone is equal? So we are bound by laws. States are bound by laws. Nations are bound by laws, but to what extent are they bound by laws? Because they can sort of do whatever they want if they want. And we see around the world states doing different things, right? They are making different decisions. They make whatever decisions they choose to make. And not every state agrees on what is, let me rephrase that. Not every state across the world agrees on the same values. Now, Blakey notes, because terrorism is a tactic and not an ideology, states of any kind can perpetrate terrorism. So she says, look, states, in the way that they behave, can commit acts of terrorism. They can do the same things that non-state entities can do. And that is a difficult thing to sort of grasp and cope with. Now, we definitely remain more comfortable discussing state-sponsored terrorism. So anytime an actor is a non-state actor, but they're supported by a state. So something like Hezbollah. Hezbollah is funded by Iran, and Hezbollah then goes and commits attacks, commits terrorism. And so that is something that we're definitely more comfortable talking about. State funding of terrorism. But an actual state entity committing terrorism is something that is quite new. And from a US government perspective, it's something that wasn't really considered or conceptualized until the Iranian Republican Guard Corps were designated as a terrorist organization. This was really the first instantiation of a government entity being labeled as a terrorist organization. And this is interesting from political theory and philosophical sort of understandings of legitimacy and autonomy, because you have this idea that states are sort of free to do what they want and bounded by the laws of their own states. And we do have international law, right? And so international law can supersede an individual state's law, an individual nation's law, but this is new territory. State terrorism is new territory. People have been talking about it, scholars have been talking about it for decades now, but in terms of it actually being a real thing in the United States, this is quite new territory. So requirements for a definition of state terrorism need to include things like coercion and repression. So again, though, taking from Althusser, who's a French sociologist and philosopher, he comes up with these ideas of these definitions for ideological state apparatuses, repressive state apparatuses. So these are the things that we all, in whatever country you live in, that you live under. So your ideological state apparatuses are things like the media and religion and culture, right? The things that make you act the way you do, the things that make you behave properly in public. The example I always give when I teach sociology is, why do you drive on the correct side of the road? You don't have to, and the answer is, well, you do, right? Well, that's a part of the ideological state apparatus. Anytime you see your response is, well, that's just the way it's done, that's the ideological state apparatus working. Repressive state apparatus are things like the police, the military, depending on where you live. Anytime you have an entity that's a state entity that is going to repress you when you break a law, when you break a norm, that's the repressive state apparatus in action. So the repressive state apparatus
Sorry, Marcus, I just accidentally. Can you quick share your screen again?
Yeah.
I apologize.
That's all right. So ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses are not in any way negative or positive. They're sort of neutral entities, and they're requirements for us to have complex societies. But really the question becomes, when it comes to state terrorism, at what point do they become, do these activities become illegitimate? Do they become, in some ways, coercive or repressive to such an extent that they are now a tactic, like a terrorist tactic? So in liberal democracies and in many countries, there's an extreme amount of gray area here. So to conclude, where does that really leave us? Well, throughout the definitions, we refuse to hold ourselves accountable. A true universal human rights law has to hold everyone accountable equally. So we have to be able to remove politics from these definitions, and we have to be able to just really call terrorism when we have defined it as such. So whatever the definition is, if you've crossed that line, and then you've committed that crime, this is the sort of more difficult part of this. Academic definitions are going to continue to grapple with holding states and non-state actors accountable for the tactics they use and for the conduct they use. But I do think there's general hope here. I'm not generally a pessimist, so I sort of leave you with Kristiva's sort of a quote from her, that by recognizing our uncanny strangeness, we shall neither suffer from it nor enjoy it from the outside. The foreign is within me, hence we are all foreigners. There are lots of ways to interpret Kristiva's work here, and what I really think is present here is that we are all strangers. So we can other everything that is not ourself. But as soon as we recognize that we are also an other, we have the ability, I think, to transcend terms like terrorism and labeling someone as the other in a negative context. Now, that doesn't really solve the definitional issues, but I really believe that overcoming the urge to terrorism requires this universal recognition of everyone's dignity and humanity. That is really what I see as the sort of one of the drivers that allows terrorism to occur, because you are able to say, this person is not like me, this person is less than me, and I am going to now commit an attack against them to preserve my way of life, or to protect what I believe. So with that, what questions do you have? Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for being here.
All right, fantastic. So Marcus, you're welcome to either switch to the next screen. I know that you have your contact information up, and then,
oh yes,
yeah, that's perfect.
Feel free to reach out.
Yeah. So our first question is in terms of interorganizational violence. So violence committed either within a terrorist organization against its own members due to infighting, or perhaps violence as a result of just fighting between terrorist organizations that involves that has, I think, collateral damage in terms of civilian population is attacked as well. Would this be considered terrorism?
Yeah, I think, sorry, I think definitely so, because you're really where I fall back on, and I'll go back a few slides, is really, I think the most comprehensive definition that we have is the GT's definition, and I really do like it. I wouldn't have included it otherwise, but you have two groups. You have a terrorist organization that is now split into two. This happened in Corsica, I think in the 80s. You have an organization that splits in two, and okay, one of them is trying to attain power over the other. So I think that fits criterion 1, and then criterion 2, evidence of intention to coerce, intimidate, or convey some other message to a larger audience. If you start attacking another group of terrorists, you have this desire to, intimidate that group. Definitely when you are killing civilians and you're a non-state actor, in my opinion, this is not a part of the definition as such, but you could put it under criterion 3. If you are killing civilians, then that is not legitimate warfare activity, and it breaks international humanitarian law.
All right, great, thank you. So our next question is, drug cartels want to maintain political instability to allow a permissive environment so that they can continue their work or their illegal activity. Would attacks by drug cartels who would want to maintain that political instability, would that be defined as terrorism?
I think definitely so. But one of the problems that you have there is understanding their intent. So this is where it gets difficult, because it's difficult to really understand the intent of a violent act. And some of that goes to things like culture. So me as an outside observer, sitting in suburban Maryland, I don't necessarily know what a drug cartel's intent is if they dump. So like in Mexico, we've seen instances where cartel members will show up at a square, open up the door to a van, and dump a whole bunch of bodies out onto the street into the park area, right?
Mm.
Well, that has a message attached to that, but it is not a message that's intended for me, and it's not a message that I understand necessarily. And so that's where the breakdown can occur. We have to know what that message is, and we have to be able to suss that out. And if it's put into press reporting or social media posts, then that's something that we can then judge. Yes, there's a meaning to this. This is not just your typical organized crime, like we saw, in the early 20th century. That's probably about the first 30, 40 years of the 20th century in places like New York and Chicago, where there was lots of gangland violence. Or going back to the 80s, 90s in places like LA, where we saw gang violence at extreme levels. Right? So it depends on what the messaging is. It depends on who the message is for. It depends on the context.
Okay. And that our next question is a request to elaborate more on the difference between terrorism and armed criminal groups, but it sounds like you kind of just answered that in terms of it's about intention. It's about what the organization intends to do.
Yeah, I think definitely. And there is definitely a gray area between things like what is a legitimate successionist group versus an illegitimate successionist group. And that's why on that slide, I put South Ossetia with a question mark, because with South Ossetia, it depends on who you ask. Some people say, if you're the Russians say South Ossetia wants to be free. They want to be free of Georgia. You stand at the border. I have never stood at the border, but I've watched a few documentaries where they interview people across the barbed wire fence, and they're like, well, I have no interest in being Russian. So that's a really complex and complicated topic.
Okay. That makes sense. That's why we're here. So have you, our next question is, have you all explored the extent to which terror management theory, the anxiety brought on by the fear of death, may play into terrorism?
I have not. That's really interesting. I've never even heard that before, to be honest.
I actually have. I happen to have a master's degree in forensic psychology. And that's not something that we study so much. We don't have as many, our research is largely empirically based. And so it's things that we can measure, like number of attacks and number of casualties, things like that. But some of our research affiliates have checked that out. So I might recommend looking at our website and just searching terror management theory to see what research we might have. I can't promise you'll find anything, but you might. So our next question is, how are you going to categorize in the normative definition the policy of legitimate government that leads or encourages terrorism?
That's a fantastic question. And that's where the GTD has I think, a legitimate blind spot, because the GTD does not catalog state violence as terrorism. So that's something that I think eventually needs to get addressed, especially now that the GTD is separate from any government policy and any government definition. But in my opinion, now that we have the United States government saying there's a foreign government entity that is a terrorist organization, regardless of whether or not any one particular person agrees or disagrees with that, we need to come to grips with that. We need to grasp, what does that look like? And really at what point, and this is where you need a political theorist, because you have to sort of grasp it. At what point does a government illegitimately use its ability to and its power to of life over death. I recommend, if you haven't read it, Giorgio Agamben's Homo Secure. So that book came out, I think, in 2000, and he does a really good job of talking about these issues, basing them in very old antiquity and Roman law, and this sort of idea of, at what point and how does government get to use its authority over life and death. Foucault, Michel Foucault also addressed this quite elegantly in his books and his work. So yeah, this is a topic of discussion. It's been a topic of discussion for quite some time, and different scholars pull it apart in different ways. But the state committing illegitimate forms of violence is definitely sort of new territory.
Okay, great. I have one question. Why does the GTD stop in 2018?
Yeah.
You can answer that if you want, or I can.
Yeah, so the GTD is a really comprehensive collection process, and they are, the best way for me to describe them is busy bees. So it starts in 2018 because it takes them, the vast majority of it is coded by humans. This is one of the reasons why it's so good, because if it's in there, it has been baked with like absolute love and dedication by the staff. They have pored over every single case that's included, and what that results in is that they do have a 1 year lag in their in what they provide publicly. So they are, I believe, readying for releasing 2019 data. Fingers crossed. Typically, they release it. They released last year's numbers the summer after that year. So that's why it ends at 2018 right now.
Great. So our next question is, how far has counterterrorism been implemented by the UN and other countries? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a really good question. I'm not a counterterrorism scholar. I have friends that are. So I don't do a lot of work there, and so I can't give you like any kind of expert opinion on that, unfortunately.
That's okay. Again, that might be check out our website and look at the research that has been done either by ourselves or by some of our research affiliates. And so we have one question on terrorism situations in India. Should there be a specific definition in the Indian context? And I think we could kind of extend that to several different types of regions. Are there certain regions that we have to define terrorism within a specific context of that region?
So that's one of the sort of things about the definitions that are enabled by the UN Security Council. So India as a country is allowed to define terrorism how they choose to define it. Whether or not international human rights law should have its own sort of carve-outs by country. I'm not a huge fan of relativism as such. So I tend to think no, and I think an academic definition needs to be universally applied, because it just, when you don't do that, what you're saying is that there are certain people who can permissibly commit a type of violence and other people who are not permissibly allowed to commit that type of violence. And as someone who thinks that violence should only be perpetrated under very extreme circumstances and under very extreme reasons, I really just sort of struggle with what that would look like.
Sure. And so our next question is, do you think that post-COVID-19 we'll see some kind of evolution in the way that we define terrorism?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of like, I can often sound pessimistic, but I'm actually quite the optimist. And so I think we are on the cusp of many different things as a global society, in various domestic realms, um, and I don't know what's going to come out of it. I would love to see us spend the time that we have, those of us who are sort of stuck at home, renegotiating and redefining a whole bunch of different things about violence and terror and society and the way we look at each other. And I think that's sort of yet to be seen.
Sure. We also have a request. You mentioned a book. Would you be able to repeat the title of that, and I can add it in the chat?
Yeah, that is Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer, HOMO space SACER. It's Latin for sacred human.
Okay.
Or sacred human.
By George, and can you spell his last name?
Giorgio Agamben, so it's AGAMBEN.
Okay, there we go. And let me see, where's our next question? Where do paramilitaries or death squads fit in the terrorism spectrum, especially when there are cases where states might want to strategically outsource violence to non-state groups in order to maintain plausible deniability?
Right, that's where things like Hezbollah come in. We like I said, I mean, we are much more comfortable calling state-sponsored terrorism state-sponsored terrorism. That is a term that is much easier to sort of grasp. And so we do have instances of that. Those are things that are in the GTD. They are in other databases as well. And so those kinds of extrajudicial killings, especially extrajudicial targetings of civilians, quite easily will fit into most definitions of terrorism.
Okay, great. At this point, I'll note we do have 2 minutes left. I have one more question. Marcus, are you able to stick around in case we get any more questions, or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll ask this one last question, unless anyone else has any other questions. To what extent is the difficulty of defining terrorism baked into the enterprise of terrorism scholarship? States benefit by a type of violence that is difficult to define and identify because such ambiguity allows states to use the terrorism label to their advantage.
Yeah, no, that's really eloquently asked. I mean, that's really eloquently put together. It is difficult to study terrorism. I think terrorism is, in terms of the social sciences, one of the most inherently difficult things to study. And it's one of the reasons why I really enjoy leading the graduate program, because it requires sort of dancing between different fields. So all of the different social sciences, sociology, psychology, political science, and when you get into methods of how you analyze terrorism, you are really looking at having to pull from all different fields because you have scholars from all different fields sort of putting in their own 2 cents, and all of it is worthwhile. All of it's useful and needed to construct what is causing terrorism. Why does terrorism occur? What are ways that we can mitigate terrorism? States definitely use this to their advantage because as soon as you are defined as a terrorist by a state, particularly by a very powerful state like the United Kingdom or the United States or the European Union, then you have a very difficult time doing much of anything. It sticks to you for perpetuity. It's very difficult to sort of escape the label of terrorist once you have gotten that label attached to you. That's a part of Becker's labeling theory. How do you move on from those kinds of things? So yeah, states definitely use them to their advantage. And as far as being a terrorism scholar, this is one of the things that we grasp and grapple with.
Sure. So we do have one more question. I will note that it is 1 o'clock for those of you who have to duck out now. We will have the recording of this event available on our website a little by the end of today, in case you have to duck out. But we do have one more question. So Oh, I'm getting more questions, so that's okay. You're welcome to keep sending me questions as long as Marcus is available to stick around and answer them, I say. But our next question is, what about the drug cartels attacks with the motive of changing the Colombian government extradition policy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the extraditables, yeah, definitely, they fit under a terrorist organization, and those attacks are included in the GTD.
Okay. I think this is a follow-up to the previous one. Your opinion on maritime terrorism and right-wing terrorism. I'm not sure if that's whether.
I mean, like, those are things, like, yeah.
Right,
I mean,
right. So if for the person who sent me that, if you could clarify your question, I would appreciate that. Thank you. Let me see. Our next question is, are there any objective criteria to distinguish terrorists from freedom fighters?
Objective criteria. I mean, I really think that the best thing that you can fall back on is the GTD's definition. You know, so you have here, this is kind of, in my opinion, the beauty of it, because if you have a freedom fighter, obviously a freedom fighter's goal is to attain a political, economic, religious, social goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the type of flavor of freedom fighter that they are. Now, what may be the case is that they're not doing this part, this criterion two, where they're trying to intimidate or convey some other message to a larger audience. This goes back to that international human rights law and what Ben Saul was saying, that if you're targeting military targets, then you're potentially not a terrorist. And then it has to be outside of the context of legitimate warfare activities. Well, if you're freedom fighters, so, you know, and you're focused on military targets, and you are committing some sort of, dare I say, civil war, then that would be sort of seen as legitimate, maybe frowned upon, but legitimate, right? It wouldn't be terrorism, but that's the difficulty of 1373, like a state, and that's sort of the, you know, when I go back to this, right? This is where you get that disagreement that's really unhelpful with the international community, where you have some people seen as freedom fighters, and some groups see like the Palestinians as freedom fighters. That's what the UN views them as, and then Israel says they're terrorists. Hezbollah, Lebanon, Israel says Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. The United States says it's a terrorist organization. It is a terrorist organization. But then other folks say, well, no, that's not. They are freedom fighters. The PKK is another example that readily comes to mind. So these groups are out there, and they do all kinds of different things. And so there's no universal way of saying you're a freedom fighter, you have the world's blessing to be a freedom fighter.
Sure. I think we have a good follow-up to that, asking about Nelson Mandela's organization, the ANC, who obviously, from their perspective, they were certainly freedom fighters, and from most people's perspective, I think, considering they were combating apartheid, but of course, from the South African government standpoint, they were considered terrorists. So can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know what you just said is quite elegant. That's basically how that works. And so in some contexts, and to be a bit over crass, like, it depends on whether or not the freedom fighter wins. So if you are successful, then you are considered, you know, a freedom fighter. If you're not, you're considered a terrorist. That's not really a great way of defining it, though. And that's not really a complete definition, because there are definitely failed self-determination, instances of failed self-determination attempts that are sort of, I think, objectively heartbreaking to look at.
Sure. That's kind of similar. I mean, our own country kind of started as a result of an insurgency. So
Right.
Right. So that's the last of the actual questions that I'm seeing, but as long as nobody has any other questions, I can talk slowly in case anybody's typing furiously right now. But as long as we don't have any other questions, I want to say thank you, Marcus, for joining us today. I think this was a fantastic presentation. And I'll just put a link into our events page. So if you enjoyed this particular event, you are welcome to check out our other events that we have coming up. And again, thank you, Marcus, so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone else for joining us as well. And I will tell everyone a good day.
Thanks, guys.